Hey everybody, it's Mark with MainWP, and today I have Jen Harries with me, and we're going to talk about accessibility. So I'm going to let Jen introduce herself and tell us a little bit about what she does. Take it away, Jen.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm Jen Harries, and my company is the Easy Alley Guide, where we help agencies figure out accessibility, including a lot of SOPs or standard operating procedures, and how the heck to tackle it all. So I started out with WordPress in about 2011. And since then, I've been building WordPress websites, working with a lot of individual businesses, small solopreneurs, multi-million dollar companies, a bunch of different agencies. I've seen a lot. And then in about 2019, I got into web accessibility, and mostly because it was a really interesting rabbit hole. And I'm an engineer and I like really interesting, paths to go down. And accessibility is really wide, it's really deep, it's really interesting in a lot of technical aspects. So I got into it mostly from a curiosity standpoint. And then after a bit, I was like, you know what? We are treating a lot of people like crap on the internet, and we need to do better. So it's really it's grown into more of a passion, but it kind of started as more of an intellectual excursion.
Okay, great. That sounds interesting. So I get the whole curiosity thing. So do you still find that in a rabbit hole? Are you still digging deeper into it, or do you feel like
Oh, definitely.
yeah, yeah. So it's is it one of those endless things? I take it.
It's a lot like web security and a lot of other things. It's a constantly evolving thing. The internet, as we all know, is not static. It doesn't just stay as it is. Technology is constantly advancing, and you either keep up to date and you pivot and you learn things, or you get way behind.
So A11Y, I remember the first time I heard the term or saw the term, I had no clue what it was. Where does that come from? What does it mean?
So it comes from back in the kind of beginning of Twitter when everyone was trying to cram everything into as few characters as possible so it would actually fit in a tweet. And what happens is a lot of these bigger, more complicated words got scrunched down to 4 characters. So between A and Y in accessibility, you eliminate 11 characters. Just like internationalization, between I and N, you eliminate 18 characters. And one of the
Okay.
nice things with accessibility is that also, became the word ally, which
Ally,
means
yeah.
friend. And
Yeah.
I love that, kind of double meaning because you're now an accessibility friend.
Oh, that's interesting. And I know that it seems like a lot of the people who are at least the most vocal people that I know when it comes to accessibility, they do seem to be allies. And I always thought that that's what A11Y, that was like where my mind went, was that it's like an ally. Yeah, I remember. I want to go back to the first time I had never even heard the term accessibility, and I had not even really thought about it. It was back at ServerPress. I was at a WordCamp, and we had a booth there, and it was WordCamp Milwaukee, and we actually had a blind woman do a presentation. I thought it would be an interesting presentation, and hey, this is unique, something that nobody's done. And so then I had her come down, sit down, and she said, let me show you how hard it is for a blind person to do something. And I said, okay. And it was really, pardon the pun, but it was really
Eye-opening.
eye-opening. Yeah, I know it's probably the most used pun when it comes to accessibility, but she sat down with a desktop server and she literally struggled with it for 30 minutes trying to get it working. Now, this is something where we claim you can get a WordPress site running locally within 5 minutes. And and it took her 30 minutes. And she did figure her way through, but that was when I became very aware of how far behind we were. And this was, I want to say this was like around 2014 or something like that. So a good 10 years ago, 11 years ago. That was just a piece of software. If you're just starting an agency, what do you tell people? Because it sounds so intimidating to make things accessible. And it seems like people who are proponents of accessibility and allies, which I suppose we all should be when you get right down to it. But people like yourself, experts, it sometimes seems like I don't want to sound offensive or anything, but almost be militant when you come in. And I think that sometimes that scares off people. And I'm wondering how you handle that with people, because I think that when they get immediately intimidated by that, they almost think of it as not as important or something they'll get to. Do you find that to be the case or not?
Oh, I've encountered all sorts of different reactions that different people have had to it. And I generally come back to the really basic question, why do you have a website in the first place? And the answer is usually to connect with people that I don't know and to get them into my lead funnel, to get them to sign up for my newsletter, to get them to fill out a contact form, to get them to find articles on my website. It's to communicate and connect with people that we don't know. And the thing about people that we don't know is we don't know their abilities. We don't know all sorts of things about them. And if you don't know anything about these people and you want to connect to them, and the global disability market is a multi-trillion-dollar space, that means that you're looking at a lot of people in that multi-trillion-dollar space that you want to connect with. And you don't know their abilities, and you also don't know their abilities today. Because a lot of people will build a website and they're like, this is for a perfect person in a perfect environment having a perfect day. But the reality is, almost everyone that we're trying to connect with is an imperfect person having an imperfect day in an imperfect environment. So I like to ask them kind of the three questions to get them to say yes to accessibility without necessarily bringing in the word accessibility. For example, I will ask them, so do you want someone who's riding on a train to be able to pull up your website on their phone and interact with it? Simple question, right? But by saying yes, well, we're dealing with bright sunlight and then into a tunnel. So we've got all sorts of different amounts of environmental light showing up. So we need really good contrast, really clear fonts, nicely spaced out. It's got to be mobile responsive. When we're on mobile, hover state doesn't exist. We can't rely on hover state for anything. Links need to be really obvious because a little subtle color change between your main content and your link, and I can't see that on a phone in bright sunlight. And I have 20/20 vision, and I still can't see that well
Mhm.
because,
Right.
it's all washed out. And well, we're also on a moving train. So if you've got movement on your site, that compounds the movement of the train. And it can, well, quite frankly, make you nauseous,
Mhm.
especially if you get motion sick and all sorts of other issues that people can have. So by saying yes, you're really agreeing to a whole lot of things to make your website easier for this imperfect person in this imperfect situation to use it. So
That's actually a good start. I can see that would be beneficial. Now, this does bring up a question, which is when we're talking about accessibility, it always feels like we're talking mostly about sight impaired people, but that's not the case, right?
definitely not. There's so many people that you have personally met that you don't realize they have a disability. For example, synesthesia. Most people have never heard of that word.
I have no idea what that is.
What it means is basically in the brain, some wires got crossed. And so when they go to read either words and or numbers, they get other sensory input with that reading,
Hmm.
which means that letters can literally take on colors. For some people, they can literally take on taste. Somehow the taste actually gets activated when they try and read.
Interesting.
And that's 4% of the population, which
Hmm.
means 1 in 25 people. You've met more than 25 people. in your
Mhm.
life. You've met hundreds and thousands of people in your life, which means
Mhm.
you've met a whole lot of people who experience this and you've never heard of it.
Hmm.
And the reason why is because those people are sick and tired of trying to explain it and having people not believe them. So
Sure.
they just stop talking about it.
Mm.
And Erland syndrome affects about 11% of the population. So if you know more than 10 people, probably someone with Erland syndrome. And that
I don't know what that is either.
basically the simple explanation is take your phone and hold it in front of you and bounce it and try and read it.
Okay.
And that's
Okay.
pretty much what they experience when they try and read. For them, usually the problem is too high contrast. So if you get a total black on total white or the reverse, it's the worst. If you knock that contrast down to about 18, it can actually go away for a lot of people.
Interesting.
So a small little tweak to your site, and suddenly 1 in 10 people can use it more easily.
Okay. Okay. The first thing you talked about, this the synesthesia, is that what you called it? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
synesthesia.
Synesthesia. How do you deal with that in a website?
So you don't. But
Okay.
what you do is you make sure that you don't have giant walls of text.
Okay.
Because if you have the more text together, if you have a paragraph and it's 10 lines long,
Hmm.
it's going to be worse for the person. A lot of times what they will do is they will use the Zoom feature. Either they'll use the website Zoom or they'll text Zoom. And what happens is then there's just less text for them to process at once.
So it's a bit of a sensory overload for them.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay.
And also, some of those people will turn on the select to read type screen
Hmm.
reader. So
Hmm.
if you go into your browser and you highlight a block of text, you can right click and tell it to
Hmm.
read that text to you.
Hmm.
And it will just
Okay.
read that block out. So they may read the headlines on the page and then use something like select to read out the text.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. Wow. I mean, I've already learned like a bunch that I didn't even know. You've taught me two things. And so, it does make me wonder. I always tend to think in terms of like people's budgets and things like that. And it seems to me like, obviously, the more you go down that rabbit hole, the bigger the budget has to be in order to have a website that doesn't
Well, it's a lot like
cause problems.
security,
Uh-huh.
if you think about it. If you have member logins and event registrations and e-commerce, the more functionality you have, the more you need to worry about security. The
Hmm.
more you need to focus on it, the more you need to check it at more steps, the bigger your security concern is. Well,
Hmm.
the same is true of accessibility. If
Hmm.
you have a small brochure site, what you can do is you can validate your different plugins against security issues. You can stay up to date on the security stuff, and you don't have to do a ton of work because you kind of went through and you validated your tools
Hmm.
and you said, okay, well, here's our tools, here's our standard procedures for how we handle passwords and password management. We make sure that our people are trained not to click random PDFs that they receive via email. So we have some security training, we have some vetted tools, and we go ahead and use them.
Hmm.
You can do a similar thing with accessibility. I have a streamlined 1 day build, and I
Hmm.
can reach pretty darn good on accessibility in that 1 day build because I have a streamlined process and a streamlined set of tools. And we just stick to that and we can get a very affordable and fast website up without a giant budget.
I think another thing that crosses my mind when I think about taking all of this into consideration is and there's no doubt I am not a creative person when it comes to aesthetics. So my immediate thought is, okay, it's going to be accessible but that means it's going to be ugly. Is that something that you run into where people think, well, okay, in order to make it completely accessible, it's going to be an ugly site? Or is that just me
Definitely
and the way
had
my,
that feedback before.
yeah,
And my question is, how pretty is it if people can't use it?
well,
If you wanted to go with a completely pastel color selection on a white background, well, congratulations, I can't read this on my phone outside.
I see. Yeah.
So, is your website usable
Mhm.
by people who don't have disabilities? Are you going to get conversions? A lot of accessibility is conversion optimization. This leads to better user experiences. This leads to fewer people being confused. You know, if you have a website for ordering pizza, well, guess what? On Sunday, when you've got someone on a phone who's had a couple drinks and they've got a loud football game going on, you want them to be able to order a pizza, right? Because
Yeah.
they're drunk and they definitely want to order a lot of
Yeah.
pizza.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
especially if there's been more than drinking involved.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
But you have an impaired person in a very noisy, loud situation. If
Mhm.
it's not easy to order,
Mhm.
they're going somewhere else for their pizza.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
a lot of the things that make a website more accessible, guess what? You have imperfect people in imperfect situations trying to use
Yeah,
your site, and
yeah,
you convert them or you lose them. And
yeah.
those are your two options. So when I hear that pushback that accessibility stifles creativity, the point of your website is not to draw Picasso. That's not the point of your website. You probably wouldn't want someone using Picasso drawing to build your, a sign for your business because no one would be able to read it.
Yeah.
You want someone who's going to build a nice, clear, legible sign that someone can read from across the street in a moving vehicle. So, yes, you're not going to be creating Picassos for your sign on your business, but a Picasso won't get you results. And you ultimately want results out of this sign. You don't want something to hang in a gallery.
I have to say, I really like your approach of appealing to um
Business goals.
business,
Yeah,
well,
I always
normal situations, I mean, like realistic day-to-day situations that quote unquote, I hate to use the term normal, but like normal people, like, the average everyday, because I think what a lot of business decision makers go with is, well, accessibility is only 4% of the market, and we can't design our whole website around 4% or whatever that percentage might be. They look at it as like a percentage of the total of people because someone might identify as, sight impaired or hearing impaired or something like that, rather than looking at it from the standpoint of everybody's impaired, you know.
exactly. We live in an imperfect world. We
Yeah,
take our devices out into the world. How many parents are working from home and they have a sick child in the background
yeah,
and they need to make sure that their computer does not produce any sound. So they've got it totally muted. They are not going to watch any video that doesn't have good captions.
yeah,
In fact, speaking about captions, if you want people to watch your videos who are under 40, you better have captions. Netflix had done a review of their caption usage, and it was through the roof.
yeah.
Well over half of their visitors are always using captions. These
Mhm.
people have it turned on constantly.
Yeah,
So if you're not giving them captions, well, that's what they're used to. That's
yeah,
normal. If you
yeah.
don't meet their expectations, then they go somewhere else.
I totally have used captions for as long as they've been available to me, and I am over 40. And I find that even my girlfriend, who when I started watching and I always had captions on, at first she hated it, and now she has to have captions on as well. A perfect example is when someone comes on with a foreign accent. It's going to take, on the TV with a foreign accent, it's going to take me a minute, and I grew up around lots and lots of accents, but it always takes me about 30 seconds before my ears adapt to being able to understand that. Well, if it's an important piece of dialogue in a show or something, I'm not going to go back and rewatch that 30 seconds. I'd rather just read the captions. That's really interesting. I have to say, I never really thought of it the way that you present it. I've always felt that, and I'm using the I've always felt because I'm applying my filter on everybody, and it may not be the case, but I've always felt like people like yourself, and I hope you're not offended by this, but people like yourself who are passionate about accessibility, it almost always seems like the first thing you do when you look at a website, or it doesn't even matter if it's a website, it doesn't matter what it is, everywhere you go, the first thing you go is, oh, that's not very accessible. Oh,
Yep.
it seems like that's the first words out of your mouth. I can tell you that even I personally, when that's all that I hear, it's like, yeah, but there's more to that, right? Well, if they're going to complain about it, I'm not going to do it because whatever.
Here's a recent example of one of those. I was pulling something up and I'm like, oh God, this is not accessible at all. I needed to do a check on the water line into my house because the county sent out an email or a physical thing, and I had to go on the website and use my phone and take some photos of the water line coming into my house because I wanted to make sure that it was up to code
Mhm.
and that they as a county didn't have to do anything about it. So they sent this thing to everyone in the county, and I have to fill out my name and my address. Now, this is, of course, stored on my device. This is in my
Mhm.
browser.
Mhm.
If you've correctly coded your form, all I have to do is just tap the autofill, and on my phone, the whole thing will fill out completely. But they didn't code it right. It was very poorly coded form. So I'm sitting there spending several extra minutes thumb typing in my basement next to the water line because they didn't code it right. And so I this is not a great I don't love being in the basement sitting next on the concrete floor next to the water line. It's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
my
yeah,
ideal place.
yeah.
But if they'd coded the form with accessibility in mind, I wouldn't have had to spend all that time in the basement on the floor with my phone. So
Yeah.
you're serving your people in your market by doing these good practices.
I understand that. I mentioned earlier, it seems like people who are accessibility experts are like militant. And by the way, I have lots of friends who are accessibility experts. You all react the same way with this, like, it's not accessible, it's not accessible. I mean, I get it. Like, if I see a typo or, the wrong use of an apostrophe or something, I'm that guy, right? I'm the wait, and even if it's my own typing and I do it, then I get really hard on myself. So how do you soften that? I mean, even within, say, WordPress, it seems like it's been such a battle for accessibility people to get WordPress to acknowledge that it needs to be an important part of core. Are there any other like pointers that you could give to soften that dialogue between, the people who are passionate about it and the people who just see it as almost like a necessary nuisance?
Well, a lot of those same people will say that security is not important.
Hmm.
And they'll say that we don't need to close these security things, they're not important. Well, I argue that security is important. But for example, in WordPress core, there are open security numbers. They've been sitting there open for years, and people are like, why won't you just close these? Why won't you just take a little bit of time and just close it out and get it done so it's no longer sitting there? But they're like, we don't recognize that as being important. I've talked with a number of security people and they're like, why now that, so many versions of PHP have been deprecated and tossed out, why can't we finally put into core actual beyond MD5 security hashing? Why can't we use one of the stronger ones? They've been available for so many years. Why can't we finally, in the next version of WordPress, actually put out something stronger than MD5 since MD5 has been broken many times? There's still a ton of this pushback on them, and accessibility faces a lot of these same issues where we're like, why can't you just use semantic HTML for this element? Well, because we didn't do it in the first place. I recognize that there may need to be a conversion, but it's doable.
Mhm.
We can write a conversion script. That's feasible. Why can't we give people a out of the box, cleaner, better code in the first place? And there's still just a whole bunch of pushback that they don't want to do it because
Yeah,
they don't feel it's important.
that's got to be frustrating. And I agree, a lot of people don't think security is a problem until there's a breach. And I
Yeah.
suppose that the same is true with accessibility to the degree that people don't think that that's a big deal until they're getting sued. That's really the blowback from having
Yes.
a
But the reality is I've been doing WordPress for a long time, and one site that I worked on, they called me in to do a security cleanup because they'd been notified by their hosting provider that their website was hacked. So I went in and I found files that were 3 years old with hacker tags on them.
oh wow.
PHP files had been added 3 years ago. Their site was hacked back then, but they didn't know it because it was just running a small script in the background utilizing their server resources, which is what plenty of hackers do. They run a small script in the background to utilize your server resources. I found 3 separate hacker tags in there from 3 separate time slots because it wasn't until the third hack actually defaced the website that anyone figured it out. Similar with accessibility. Yes, you got this lawsuit, but the reality is you've been losing business for years because of these issues. Yes, it's finally come to a head, someone's finally suing you about it, but there's been a whole bunch of people who've been quietly leaving your website because it wasn't good. It wasn't a
Mhm.
good experience for them.
Mhm.
And we, as people, have expectations. We go into any situation and we have expectations about how it's going to behave. I walk into my grocery store and I expect that the doors will open for me. This is my expectation. I go to a grocery store and the doors magically open. This way, when I approach them with a cart, the doors magically open for me. This is a great experience.
Yeah.
This is what I expect.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if the doors didn't open, if there weren't the curb cuts and I couldn't easily wheel my cart all over the place, I would be disappointed. I would be mad
Mhm.
because it didn't meet my expectations. And the thing that so many website owners forget is that people visit your website in the context of the other websites they were just on. So they were just on a search engine. They were just on a social media platform. And in these locations, links were in certain places. They were certain colors. It behaved a certain way. So they have all these expectations from all this previous time on the internet. And if you have bright blue text and it's not a link, they are going to click on it. Nothing's going to happen. And they're going to believe that your website is broken. I had
Yeah.
a client who I told people know that links are blue. You
Mhm.
can't have blue text that's not a link. And they
Mhm.
insisted on it. So we put it up. 2 weeks later, we have fielded so many phone calls. We have to change the blue text back to the black color that you
Yeah.
wanted
Yeah.
because everyone thinks that our website is broken because
Yeah.
it doesn't meet people's expectations.
Isn't it crazy how our brains have been trained that way to know that the blue text is a link?
Exactly.
And
Blue
yeah,
text is a link.
yeah.
Red text is an error message. Orange text is a warning. Green text is a success message. And people don't read these things anymore. They
Yeah.
just see, oh, error, and they close the page. They
Yeah.
say, oh, green, it was successful. They don't read the message and they continue on because it must have been successful because it's green. And if you don't meet people's expectations, then they're disappointed.
Let's say you're a small time like one person shop, maybe not even an agency, but let's say you're doing your own website and you have enough of the technical chops to run WordPress and set up your own site, and you're just like a little mom and pop shop and you just want it for your own site. Where would you tell them to start with accessibility? Because it sounds like just like with everything else with security and all that, it has to be like it's a lot easier to deal with from the beginning than it is to go back and retroactively fix things. So if you were to say, okay, here it is, at the very minimum, this is what you need to do in order to make it appeal to, 90% of the public out there, what would you say that those bullet points are?
So I have a quick audit,
Mhm.
and on my site, I've done several presentations on the quick audit. There's a whole learn page. If you go to my site and you click on learn, there's a quick audit information, and it videos and walks you through each of the steps. But
Okay.
basically, these are the kind of 80/20. So you're familiar with the 80/20
Right,
principle,
right,
where 80% of the problems come from 20% of the stuff.
right.
Well, when it comes to web accessibility, we have a set of criteria called WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And guess what? Less than 20% of those criteria account for more than 80% of the issues.
Okay.
So it's a good thing to kind of follow this 80/20 principle and focus on this set of criteria that account for the majority of the problems.
Mhm.
That's, dealing with about 15% of the criteria is a whole lot less scary than dealing with all of them.
Mhm. Yeah, well,
So
I agree.
So I have this quick audit process, and it guides you through these individual steps. I've got several videos that literally walk you through the different steps, and these are things that, one, are flagged the most in audits, and two, these are things that really impact how usable your website is for the person sitting in their basement trying to take a photo of their water line and fill out the form with their name and their address. And does your form function properly? Are the labels nice and clear? Does it have autocomplete on it? It walks you through the different key things that make a website a better experience for a lot of people, and really address the key issues that will be most of the time the big problems.
Yeah. Okay, that's good because, especially small business owners are always considering that point of where you get like diminished returns, right? On your time investment and everything. And so
Yes.
I that's
And to pre-qualify kind of a website, I've also got a lightning audit, which is literally like, it takes me 1 minute, so it'll probably take someone else about 5 or 10. And
Mhm.
what it is it's just 7 checks that you can do really fast. Basically, based on the outcome of those 7 checks, I can tell you whether it's good, bad, or ugly,
Okay.
just on that very quick set of those checks, because I've seen a lot of websites, I've done a bunch of audits, and if you are hitting those 7 criteria and you've hit all 7 of them, you probably have very few errors on your site. If you
Okay.
have failed every one of them, your site is probably a train wreck needing to be rebuilt.
Okay. Well, that's good. I
And
mean, that's
so
good
it's
info.
it's a it's a very, very quick test, and it doesn't require knowing how to use a screen reader. It doesn't require all of that stuff. It's just a short set of the 7 checks, and you go through, you do them, and you can kind of get your good, bad, or ugly situation kind of qualified.
Well, that's actually really cool.
Speaking about the audits, I always tell people there are 4 kinds of audits. There's a preliminary audit, a working audit, a verification audit, and a junk audit. And the preliminary one, that's that lightning audit, something you just want to get a really quick, is it good or bad? You want that just really quick assessment of, is it good or bad, so I know whether I'm looking at a mess or I'm looking at something that's pretty good. That's used a lot of times to qualify a website, to determine, is this a good candidate? Is this a bad candidate? Are we sending them to remediation or to rebuild? You know, give you a good idea of what we're going to do. Then there's the working audit. And so this is where the quick audit comes in. And that goes through these top issues, and it tells you what the issue is, what failed, why it's wrong, where that source is coming from. So if it's a form problem, it's coming from a form plugin. Well, is it a misconfiguration or is it the plugin itself? So for example, with WS form, you're familiar with that one.
Mhm.
And there are settings that you can make some really bad choices. So is it on you because you made the bad choices, or did the plugin itself not allow you to do something well? And I know Mark, I've worked with Mark, so
Yeah.
the plugin will allow you to do things well, but
Hmm.
did you make good choices? And
Yeah.
so the quick audit goes into the what is wrong and also why it's wrong. So it looks at the source of the issue. So this is a very useful audit because it's a working audit. You can work with this information. This information will allow you to solve problems. Then there's the verification audit, and that is to verify that it's actually fixed. So that's much more of a regimented line by line on like the WCAG criteria going through and verifying that yes, it's working correctly. And then finally, there's what I call a junk audit. And this is those companies that want to just go to Screaming Frog and output a list of image alt text. That's not helpful because image alt text has to be reviewed in the context of the image. If the image is being used as a link, it needs to have text indicating where that link goes.
Sure.
The image could be added to a blog post after the fact just to create some white space and add a little visual interest. So you have empty alt text because it's really just decorative. And there's other times that that image could be important in conveying meaning, in which
Mm.
case it needs to be appropriately written to convey meaning. And still in other times, a caption is a much better choice. So
Mm.
we leave the image without alt text sometimes, and we put a caption because everyone wants to know that Joe Smith is getting the 2025 Best Website Award. We want to put that as a caption below the image because we want to convey that to absolutely everyone.
Mm. Okay. Good feedback there. I'm thinking about all the things that I add alt text to. I don't go to Screaming Frog, but I know what you're saying. And
Yes, but it
yeah,
can
yeah,
make
yeah,
a big it can
yeah.
make a whole lot of quick analysis spreadsheets and CSV files for you. But the question needs to be, are they actually useful
Useful.
for your case? And just outputting the alt text without any context is not useful.
Yeah.
So I call those junk audits because there are some companies out there who try and offer them as a quote unquote audit, and they're really just junk because they don't tell you anything productive.
So it really does sound like, I mean, it's definitely that age-old saying of just be deliberate with everything that you do. In other words, make
Yes.
sure everything you do on your website has a use and has a purpose and can be seen by as many people as possible. Because you're not going to ever get 100%. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is, it's good to shoot for the 100%, but you're never really going to hit that. Is
It is
that
possible to hit that, but is it practical for everyone to fuss about that last 5%? Probably not, but you can definitely be hitting the 90%.
well, and it's
90% is very achievable.
it's a matter of shifting. I mean, just talking with you, it's shifted my approach, say, in that defining what that 5% is. In other words,
Hmm.
before it was the 5% were the people who had special needs, when in reality, that's not the case. The
Not at all.
5%, the 5% are truly going to be, well, are mostly going to be outliers, like real,
Yes.
but that 90 to 95% is everybody. I mean, so you really, I get what you're
That is
saying.
your audience.
That's your
If you're
audience. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
making something accessible, if you're not using these good practices, you are making the website a mess for a lot of people.
This is more of a philosophical question then. Do you think that there needs to be a shift in the message that accessibility experts put out there rather than the impression that we get, those who sit outside those lines? It is for a very specific small percentage of people. And it almost feels like that's the message that gets pushed out by
So
accessibility experts.
a lot of that message is driven by the venture capital companies. That's where a
You can
lot
say
of that.
mainstream media. No, I'm kidding.
So a lot of that
Yeah.
message is driven by the venture capital companies because they're the ones funding these overlay companies. And these
Mm.
overlay companies are pushing really, really hard. You must do this and use our tool to be compliant with the law. Well, one of these big companies, Accessiby, is currently being fined by the US government for false advertising because they don't make your website compliant. The US government says that they do not make your website compliant. And that's true. I've tested it. In many cases, it actually makes it worse
Really?
because automation is good at some things. Automation is not good at everything.
Mm.
One of the things that automation is particularly bad at testing for is keyboard navigation. So when these automated solutions run and they make changes, they aren't able to test for if keyboard navigation is working well, and they're not able to test for if they've broken keyboard navigation because all of the automation so far has been really terrible at being able to test keyboard navigation. If they can't test it, they don't know if they broke it. And the EU also put out a statement saying that if you want to comply with European accessibility laws, don't use an overlay. They put out a big statement saying that accessibility overlays will not make your website compliant with European laws.
Okay.
They just flat out said that. US government has just said that overlays won't make your site compliant, and the European Union has said that overlays won't make your website compliant. So I don't know what else you need to hear, but they're not going to solve the whole problem for you.
Right, right. Speaking of the laws and everything, I think that a lot of people are fearful and hopeful that they don't get sued or whatever. What do people really need to be when it comes to laws and being sued or being fined or whatever? What do people really, really need to be aware of when it comes to that?
Number one is a lot of the times when you are sued, it's because you weren't easy to contact. So the first thing I always tell people is put your accessibility statement in the footer of your website and have it on every single page because this allows people a method to contact you without going to a lawsuit. This says that you want to receive their feedback. And if they send you feedback, you need to receive and respond to that feedback. The next thing is these predatory lawsuits that are
I'm
coming
curious about
out
those
of New
too.
York and California.
Right. I was going to
A
ask
lot
that
of these
next.
predatory lawsuits, they are looking for low-hanging fruit. If you go and you solve this 90%, if you make your website better for most people, if you make it easier to use, you make the user experience improved, the color contrast better, the alt text fixed, the forms with autocomplete and easy to use. If you fix all of these issues, you are no longer low-hanging fruit. And these predatory lawsuits, they're going for low-hanging fruit. Let's be honest, every time I've seen one, there's like 15 things that they're itemizing out as did not work, could not use, was not able to. It's at least 15 things on these lawsuits.
Mhm.
So fix them. Don't have them there in the first place. These lawsuits can charge you 25 grand and up. Just spend a couple grand and fix it. Make your website convert better, make it more usable to people, and you've really, really reduced your lawsuit risk.
And the
And
investment is worth it because you'll, like you said,
exactly.
yeah, it's more usable. So you're going to get more conversions theoretically.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
You still need good content.
Yeah, you need good content and something worth, getting people to open up their wallets and all of that. But yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I I think those are all the questions that I have. Is there anything that you wanted to add that maybe we didn't cover that I might have forgotten or was too naive to ask?
Accessibility just really comes down to, do you want part of a multi-trillion dollar market? Do you want people to be able to use your website when they're having an imperfect day and they're in an imperfect place? It really just comes down to that.
I really love that. It actually makes things almost crystal clear to me, like it's a no-brainer, like kind of decision. So I appreciate that.
It comes down to processes. So many things in web development come down to processes. You're going to have terrible security if you have no security processes. You're going to have terrible accessibility if you have no processes to include it. So it's really about getting these SOPs, getting them together and using them.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Where can people find you? Go ahead and give your website again, and then
Yeah.
other places that people might be able to find you.
So the website is easyalleyguide.com, and we have a whole bunch of video tutorials. I have information on, for example, how to sell accessibility to clients, how to walk them through it. One of the videos has the 3 yeses that I talked about, and getting them to say yes to, I want to include people. And once they've said yes to that, then you go and you say, well, great news. Since you want to include people, there's a set of guidelines and they're out there and we can just follow those guidelines. And this is how we will fulfill your goals for your site. And that way it ties following the guidelines to people's goals, which really helps convey that this is important, because now to say, I don't want to follow the guidelines, well, that's how we're meeting your goals. So you do
Right.
not want your goals anymore?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that tie-in really helps to keep it sold even after the initial discussions.
Yeah,
And then you can
that would be
also find me
important.
on
Yeah.
LinkedIn
LinkedIn, which is how
and
I,
YouTube.
yeah, that's how I communicate with you. So is LinkedIn. So fantastic. Well, Jen, I appreciate it, and I hope you have a great day and a good New Year, good 2025.
Thank you. You too.
All right, thanks.